Well, let's shift into the Ten Commandments, because that's kind of the heart and
Sure.
soul of your book, and the second commandment specifically, right?
Yes.
The name command. We all learned as children not to take the Lord's name in vain, and usually
Right.
that meant not attaching the word God to some sort of profanity or something like
Right.
that. You take a very different, or you encourage us to think about that much more broadly. We
Yes.
still don't encourage attaching the Lord's name to profanity,
Correct.
but
Good clarification.
but there's more going on there.
There
Help
is.
us understand your approach to that, and we'll
Sure.
talk about it.
Yeah, so I wrote my doctoral dissertation on this command. I'll just hold it up because if we have any real nerds out there who like to read dissertations, it's published as Bearing Yahweh's Name at Sinai, a re-examination of the name command of the Decalogue. So bearing God's name is my attempt to take what I learned in my doctoral work and make it accessible more broadly. So yes, the command in Hebrew does not say anything about speech or oath-taking or swearing, magic. There are, I've counted 23 different ways people interpret this command, and I outline those in the dissertation as I kind of consider the history of interpretation. But most have assumed that the command has something to do with speech, what we shouldn't say or do with God's name. In fact, the Hebrew says, if we translate it very woodenly, you shall not lift up or carry the name of Yahweh your God in vain. For Yahweh will not equip one who carries his name in vain. And so most translators or interpreters have come to that sentence and said, well, that doesn't really make sense. We don't carry names, so this must be figurative or idiomatic. It must be referring to something else, or it must be shorthand for a longer phrase. And so many conclude that it's shorthand for you shall not lift your hand and swear to the name. So this is what you're lifting, not the name, but that doesn't actually work grammatically because there's a specific direct object marker on name saying that's the thing that's being lifted or carried. So I asked in my study the question, what would this mean if it did make sense? Like, what could this possibly mean if we didn't take it as shorthand for something else? Is there a sense in which Israel carries Yahweh's name? And you don't have to look very far at Sinai to find a very concrete example of this. So in chapter 28, Moses gets the instructions for constructing the high priestly garments. And the high priest is going to have 12 gemstones on his chest, each one inscribed with one of the names of the tribes. And then it says, and so Aaron shall bear the names of the sons of Israel before Yahweh. And it's the same phrase, bear with name, that we see in the name command. And not only that, he's also wearing a name on his forehead, and it's the name Yahweh. So he has two words on his forehead, Kadosh LeYahweh, holy, belonging to Yahweh. And there's a sense in which Aaron is a visual model of what the entire nation is supposed to be as a kingdom of priests. We're told in Exodus 19:6 that they are to be a kingdom of priests. And Aaron is a priest, so we look at him to find out what does it mean to be a priest. And he represents the people to God by wearing their names, and he represents God to the people by wearing his name on his forehead. And so I think what's happening in this command is that they're being told not to misrepresent Yahweh. They are the people who've been claimed as God's own people. And we have lots of evidence that he's claimed them as his own. One of the most explicit places that I talk about in the book is Numbers 6, the priestly blessing. May Yahweh bless you and keep you, and may his face shine upon you and give you peace. The blessing that's sometimes a benediction in our services. Verse 27 of Numbers 6 says, and so they shall put my name on the sons of Israel, and I will bless them. So there's a sense in which Aaron, as he fulfills his duties, his vocation as high priest, he's pronouncing the name over them, and it's actually doing something invisible. It's like giving them an invisible tattoo so that they now are stamped or marked or tattooed as the ones who belong to Yahweh. And therefore, they're supposed to live in such a way that his character is on display to the nations who are watching.
Outstanding. So I think one of the things that struck me most about the argument was that, like, you've taken a commandment that we've kind of really put in this narrow slot.
Mm-hmm.
And the way that you've articulated, and I think it's thoroughly persuasive, it becomes almost this comprehensive, organizing meta narrative almost. I mean, this
does.
makes sense of the entire Old Testament and Bible.
Yeah.
And it resonated deeply with my Wesleyan sensibilities. So I don't know, you probably know John Oswalt and
I
his
do.
work. So I ran into him and started reading some of his stuff in college and
Yeah.
seminary, and this idea of God entrusting his reputation to his people, and
Yes.
that's what holiness means, was very prominent.
Yes. Yes.
I don't ever recall getting into the kind of stuff you've argued, but it resonated. What you argued just fit very neatly with that. And particularly his reading of Ezekiel 36 and some things like that. We can talk about that in a minute if we want to, but I was just, it's not often you pick up a book in biblical studies and it kind of gives you this just really big picture, everything makes sense in light of this. And I thought that this book did that quite nicely.
Thank you. Yeah, that was the surprise. I suppose every PhD is in danger of thinking that their topic is the most important topic and that it explains everything. But I really do think that this is a central theme in Scripture. So if you, there's lots of debate about what's the center of biblical theology. I think whatever the center is holds together God's purposes for creation and the expression of the covenant. And so I think when it comes to creation and covenant, the theme of bearing God's name is an expression of this covenant dimension, where if we look at the places where God reiterates the covenant with his people throughout the Old Testament, there's usually two aspects of it. I will be your God and you will be my people. Those are the two sides of the same coin. Like, I'm the only one you're going to worship and you're the only ones I'm picking. And there's this exclusive loyalty and commitment. And in the 10 commandments, what I take as the first command is not to worship any other gods. And I include idol worship in that same command, because in the ancient world, there's no way to worship a god without an idol, and there's no reason to have an idol other than to worship it. So that's command number 1. God is reinforcing that first part of the covenant formula, I will be your God. And then the second command is, don't bear my name in vain. In other words, you are my people, so go out and live like you're my people. Right. And once we see that two-sided lens, if you will, you can see it all the way through Scripture, as you said, kind of an organizing principle. There are many, many passages in the Scriptures that we have often heard and quoted that are some of our favorites, but I don't think we've stopped to consider what they mean. Psalm 23, he leads me in paths of righteousness for his name's sake. What do my righteous paths have to do with God's name? Well, if I bear his name, then me walking rightly brings him glory. And if I go off the rails and start rebelling, then his name is brought into disrepute. So my right paths are for his name's sake. Yeah. Or if you think of Second Chronicles 7:14, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray, then I will hear from heaven and heal their land. That's a good favorite American verse, right? Especially for election year. And yet we haven't often stopped to think, what does it mean to be a people called by my name? And in Hebrew, it's, if my people over whom my name has been proclaimed will humble themselves and pray. Yeah. They're the people who have received this blessing that stamps them with God's name. That's why God's listening to them, because they belong to him. Yeah. And it's not America, but yeah. That's another topic.
Part 2 for that one.
Part 2 for that one.
And I think that's the thing, right? So bearing God's name in holiness, like yes. The covenant links yes. those together. So
absolutely.
The reason I picked up your book and took a look at it was because I'm doing some research this year on holiness language, yeah. Old Testament, New Testament.
Okay.
And I just found that really, really helpful, because this idea of, because we kind of take holiness, right, and we either, well, that's just God and not us, or mm-hmm. It's legalistic, kind of keep the rules. But yeah. when you understand the holiness material in light of this covenantal relationship where God has brought you into a relationship with himself, a representative relationship, where his reputation in the world depends on your character. And then that creates a relational context for the holiness language too, I think. So.
It does. And the whole law, all the laws at Sinai are relational.
Right.
And we struggle to understand holiness because we tend to think that the laws in the Old Testament were Israel's way of getting saved. But Jesus did something new in the New Testament, and he's saving us by grace, so we don't have to think about the laws anymore. And if you think that's what's going on, you can easily say, let's unhitch, because we have Jesus, we don't need these laws. But if you go back to Sinai and understand them in their context, you can quickly see that God rescues them from Egypt long before he's giving them the laws. They're marching through the wilderness for 2 months before they get to Sinai, and then he gives them the law. They've already been saved. He's already made them his people before he gives them the law. The law is their means of expressing his character to a watching world. And so you have the New Testament authors repeatedly telling us how we should live. And how we live matters because it's a aspect of our mission. Our mission is to represent God. Therefore, we need to treat people well, and we need to honor God in how we live.
Yeah. So, and to continue that, you mentioned the priestly kingdom language in Exodus 19, 4, 5, 6 in there, right? So you get priestly kingdom and holy nation, I think.
Yes.
And that's linked with this idea of treasured possession, which I think you've done some work on that language as well. And that follows this, you've seen what I did to the Egyptians. So there's this dramatic rescue, and then there's this creation of the covenant.
Yes.
Talk to us about how that, I mean, you use in the book the language of vocation, I think, with some frequency. And again, I found that helpful as well, that like Christianity or following Jesus isn't just kind of this thing I do on Sundays.
It's not a status. It's not like in the book I talk about a game of blob tag, which is the kind of tag where if you tag someone, you're both it, and then you're both running around and trying to tag more people until everyone's been tagged. And I actually think that's how salvation / election works in the Bible. And as a Wesleyan, you'll probably like my concept of corporate election that I talk about.
In the book.
Yes, I don't make a very good Calvinist. So even though I grew up in Calvinist circles. So I think what's happening when God chooses Israel is it's not that he picked them so they can sit back and rest on their laurels like, wow, look at me, God picked me. No, it's like getting tagged in a game of tag. You're it. And when you're it, you don't just sit there and look pretty, you run out and tag as many other people as you can. Now, it's true that in the Old Testament context, they're not going out on mission trips to evangelize. That doesn't happen until the New Testament. In the Old Testament, the dynamic is more of a come and see approach. And then that shifts in Acts chapter 1, and they're told to go and tell. But it is their vocation is to be faithful to the covenant so that the nations will know what God is like and they'll be drawn in. So you have Isaiah's vision of all nations streaming to Jerusalem and saying, teach us about the Lord.
So when God says to the Hebrew people, after he's rescued them, you're going to function as a kingdom of priests, right? He's inviting them to have an intermediary role.
Yes.
Presumably between him and the other nations, right? Because you get that in the context. I've chosen you from among the nations to be this intermediary.
Yes.
I've thought before, and I'm trying to remember if this came out in the book. You've got, we kind of think, right, priesthood of all believers means we don't need priests.
We don't need priests. Yeah.
But they sort of had the priesthood of all Israelites, right?
They did, and they
still
had
priests.
Yep.
So help us think through the relationship between sort of corporate priesthood and the set-aside priesthood.
Sure. Let me take a step back first and say something about the book of Genesis, because I don't think this idea of vocation is new to Exodus. One of the puzzling things about the book of Genesis is for the first 11 chapters, you have these very cosmic stories, and it involved, a huge flood and the Tower of Babel and things that seem to affect everyone on earth. And then in chapter 12, we're suddenly narrowing in on one man, Abraham, and following his family for the rest of the book. And I think these two parts work together. They're integrally connected in that the first 11 chapters shows this downward spiral of humanity in their failure to fulfill the vocation they were given in the garden, or in Genesis 1:26-28, when God makes them his image and their job is to rule. That falls apart because they dominate each other rather than working in partnership with each other to help things flourish in the world, to be good stewards of God's creation. So then he chooses Abraham, not because he's like, well, scrap that didn't work, but because he wants to restore all of humanity to their God-given design. And he's going to use the family of Abraham to do that. And in Genesis 12:1-3, he tells Abram, through you, all nations will be blessed. So he's choosing Abram from out of the nations so that he can bless all nations. And that mission of God to use Abraham's family to bless all nations is what we're seeing happen in the book of Exodus.
Yep.
He's taking Abraham's descendants and he's telling them, okay, here's how you're going to do it. Here's how to bless all nations. You walk faithfully with me. I'll show you what to do.
Yeah.
And we get these glimpses of it working, like with Rahab in Joshua chapter 2. She says, we heard what Yahweh did for you and what he did to Egypt and how he brought you through the Red Sea. And now we're all scared spitless because we know Yahweh is the real deal. Like, can I be on your team, please?
Yeah.
And
with the Adam-Abraham connection too, right? The promises to Abraham kind of reverse the curse to Adam,
they do.
right? Kind of family,
do.
land,
Yes.
childbearing, and the
Yes.
thorns instead of, flowers. I'm going to give you a family and a land to live in.
Exactly. So before I talk about priests, I'll just say that I'm writing a prequel to this book now.
Very good.
Called Being God's Image.
Good.
Because I want to talk about what does it mean to be human?
Okay.
What is our God-given vocation as humans? And what are the implications of that for creation care, for gender relations, for racial interactions, partnership? And then how is Jesus the image of God, and where is this all headed? So I'll talk about new creation. So it will take, if bearing God's name is one organizing theme through the Bible, the other one's creation. Sure. And I'm going to write the other one so that together they can give what I would say is like the heart of biblical theology.
Outstanding.
So, but you asked a question about priests, and then I went on a rabbit trail.
No,
so
okay.
Yes, God appoints them as a kingdom of priests. They have a mediatorial role, but he still appoints priests over them because, in fact, it isn't practical to have the whole nation functioning in priestly ways, like in official capacity. Being a priest has very stringent laws around it to protect the rest of the community from the dangerous holiness of God. I like how the Bible Project describes God's holiness, and they have a couple of theme videos that do a really good job. Their video on Leviticus and also their holiness video talk about God's holiness being like the sun, which is the source of life, and it's unique, and it brings warmth and light, and it's good and life-giving. But if you get too close to the sun, you die. And God's presence among his people at Sinai, he comes down off the mountain and dwells in the tabernacle, but there's a very carefully prescribed boundary preventing people from accidentally coming in too close to his presence because their own sinfulness puts them in danger of being destroyed. So Israel's job is to help facilitate other nations meeting Yahweh. But in terms of actual ritual purity, it makes the most sense for there to be specialists who memorize and understand how to do the sacrifices and how to check for mold and how to adjudicate between difficult cases, in law. And so we still need people whose full-time job it is to pay attention to worship.
Yeah. Is it fair to say that the priests model what the nation is supposed to do in that?
Absolutely.
In between
Yes.
role?
Yes.
Yeah. I've wondered sometimes if Protestants, in our sort of rejection of any sort of priestly language, in favor of the priesthood of all believers, have sort of undercut our ability to actually do it
Yeah.
Because we don't have a model for it.
We don't have a model. What we have are celebrity pastors,
right,
who fall.
which is different.
Which is
Yeah,
different.
yeah.
Yeah, the priesthood, although Aaron plays a central role as high priest, there's no one person that's indispensable to the priesthood.
Sure.
The very first thing that happens in Leviticus chapter 10, so chapter 8 of Leviticus is the ordination of the priests for their service. Chapter 9 is their first day on the job. They make sacrifices and they pronounce the blessing over the people, and God's glory appears and burns up the sacrifice and everyone celebrates. The very next thing is Aaron's sons bringing unauthorized incense into God's presence and getting zapped. Right. The fire comes out and burns them instead of the sacrifice, because what they've brought is some harebrained idea they had, not what God prescribed. And so there's a sense in biblical worship that the personality of the leader is not the important thing, or their charisma. I mean, priests do different things than pastors do today. It's not the same role. But there's a sense in which their job is to follow protocol exactly. And if they deviate from that because they think of themselves as being above the law, then they're quickly disposed of.
Yeah. But that informs the corporate vocation too, right? Because
yes, it does.
Priests have to be holy to perform their duties.
Yep.
The nation, to be a priestly kingdom, also has to be a holy nation.
Yes.
Those are linked in Exodus 19.
They are.
So there's this, and then all of a sudden you get the commandments, which tell you
how to be
that
holy.
Character looks like.
Right.
And when they fail to do that, right?
Yeah. When even one person fails to do that, it puts the entire community at risk. As we see in Joshua, I think it's chapter 7, they fight against Jericho and they win. Yeah. And God has told them to devote everything to destruction. But one guy sees something pretty in the rubble and he just can't bring himself to destroy it. So he takes this gold home and his fancy clothes and he buries them under his tent. And the Israelites lose their next battle because Achan failed to follow God's instructions. It puts everyone at risk. So just like one priest can put everyone at risk, one layperson can.
Yeah. And with entrusting God's name, or God entrusting his name to his people, highlights that his desire is to make himself known through his people.
Yes.
Right. And again, like there's this deep 24/7, you don't get to sort of clock out of this ever.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. I think that might be the most shocking thing about this for the church, this concept of bearing God's name. It's like, oh, cool. Wow. We have a vocation, but we tend to think in North America of our faith as personal and private. I can believe what I want to believe. You believe what you want to believe. We'll leave each other alone. But in fact, being a Christian is by definition joining a community and taking on God's mission. Yeah. And so there's no such thing as a private Christian, because every Christian bears God's name and therefore they're being watched. Yeah. And their job is to demonstrate God's character. So you don't get to decide, like, I'm just going to do what I want to do because God forgives me, or God has grace for that.
Yeah. So every person who calls themselves a Christian will always either be profaning or sanctifying Yahweh's name.
Yes, I think that's fair to say. Yes.
Yeah, yeah.
And Jesus comes along and teaches his disciples how to pray. And one of the first things he says is, hallowed be your name, in his prayer. Yeah. He wants God's name to be made holy again. And I never understood that until I did this study. And then I realized Jesus is committing himself to Torah obedience. Yeah. Because he says, may your name be holy. There's only one way for God's name to be holy, and that's when his people properly honor him by being faithful to the covenant.